Good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to welcome you all to this afternoon's conversation on Turkey, where we have put together a wonderful panel of experts and analysts in town. My name is Soner Çağaptay. I'm the director of the Turkish research program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. As we get started, and I welcome you all, make sure that you turn your cell phones off. We have cameras, live cameras in the room. It's indeed a great time to discuss Turkey. If you haven't realized, a lot has been going on in Turkish politics. We put together this event originally about 3 weeks ago. We sent out an invite hoping that we would discuss Turkey's Afrin operation, a very important development. But as I always do, I'd like to thank Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan for declaring snap elections since, which has boosted attendance at this event, also, I think, given us more to discuss. Turkey's incursion into Syria, of course, has really changed the dynamics in that country's war, especially in the north of Syria. YPG PKK collapsed after Turkish incursion into Afrin, and Turkey was also able to get at least implied U.S.-Russian support to its Afrin operation. Nevertheless, there are challenges, which I'd like to look at with my friends in the room in a minute in the panel. Least of which is that the Iran and Assad regime both oppose Turkish presence, risk of YPG counterinsurgency, and many other issues. Of course, all this links to Turkey's most important breaking news, snap elections on June 24th. So for that, to discuss all these issues, I invited some of my colleagues from town. Starting from my left, Gönül Tol. She's the founding director of Center for Turkish Studies at the Middle East Institute. Gönül is also an adjunct professor at George Washington University's Institute for Middle East Studies. She has taught courses on political Islam, Turkey and Middle East around the world. I'm a big fan of her analysis. She's a frequent commentator, especially when it comes to the Kurdish issue. Next to Gönül is another friend, Stein. He's a resident senior fellow at the Rafik Hariri Center for Middle East Studies, Middle East at the Atlantic Council. Aaron's research interests include U.S.-Turkish relations, Turkish foreign policy, the Syria war, especially the Syria war. I'm a great fan of Aaron's work on Syria. He can tell you there's a difference between JTS and HTS in his sleep, I think. And I often refer to his writings and analysis and sharp analysis on Syria. So we're happy to have Aaron as well. Finally, Colonel Rich Outzen is a senior U.S. Army advisor and member of State Department's policy planning staff. Rich has previously served as an instructor at National Defense University, where he taught courses on strategy in the Middle East. He's also served in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as having been posted on U.S. missions in Jerusalem and Ankara. And thanks for your service, Rich. Without further ado, I'd like to go with the panel. I've asked my friends here to comment, Gönül, on post-Afrin environment, how it looks from within Turkey, Turkey's Syria policy and Kurdish policy. Aaron, how Afrin looks from within Syria. And Rich, on how Afrin looks from the U.S. Of course, I've also asked them each to comment on snap elections in relationship to Afrin or other dynamics they'd like to bring on board. And finally, of course, to complement each other's work and commentary. I think this will be a great session. I'll be very happy to moderate it. Look forward to it. It's rare that I take the back seat, so I'm just very happy to be doing that today. Please join me in welcoming this great panel of friends and policy experts in the room. Thanks so much. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Soner. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. It's great to see so many friends in the room. Well, I've been holding at the Middle East Institute, we've been holding our Turkey conference for the 9th year this year, and every year we get a larger crowd. So I also would like to thank President Erdogan for that. He's really making our lives easy in a sense, but when it comes to explaining Turkish politics, it's become a challenge. So Soner posed the question, what is the post-Afrin environment? But I first would like to talk about what Afrin operation meant for Turkish society. If you look at from, well, not specifically Turkish society, but Turkey. So to address that, I guess I have to talk about Turkish society, how it's viewed by the society itself and the government. So for Turkish society, the Afrin operation, I believe, is not just against the Syrian Kurdish militia YPG, but it was also an anti-American operation. So in other words, it was not just an effort to root out the YPG, but it was also an effort to deal a blow to US cooperation with the Syrian Kurds. In public opinion polls conducted before and after the operation, respondents usually cite the US cooperation with the YPG as one of their reasons for supporting the operation. And in several, I saw one today, in several public opinion polls, 80% of Turkish public support the operation, and also 90% think that the US poses a great national security threat to Turkey. Of course, I mean, the reason for that sentiment is not just the US-YPG cooperation, but there are so many other issues haunting Turkey-US relations, including the issue of Fethullah Gülen and the US refusal to extradite Fethullah Gülen. So public opinion polls also suggest that economic concerns top the list of worries for Turkish society, but security concerns are also high on the list. They're important. And I think those security concerns peaked after the Syrian conflict started in 2011, but they have been mounting since 2014. I'm sure many of you will recall 2014 was the year when the US decided to airdrop weapons to the YPG. And then a year after that, 2015 also was an important year. ISIS launched attacks inside Turkey, and also in 2015 we saw the breakdown of the ceasefire between the PKK and the Turkish state. So many Turks see Turkey's Afrin operation as a legitimate response to those security challenges. But I think for Turkish government, Afrin operation's number one purpose, I believe, has been to boost Erdogan's popularity ahead of early elections. Well, at the time when Turkey launched Operation, Erdogan ruled out snap elections, but I think calling for early elections was part of his plan all along. And the second reason, I believe, for the operation from the Turkish government's perspective was using the Afrin operation. Turkey wanted to secure a strong position at the negotiating table in Syria. Turkey became, after Russia's heavy military involvement starting from 2015, I think Turkey has found itself, and of course, after the US decision to partner with the YPG, Turkey has found itself isolated in Syria. And it had to work closely with Russia, with Iran, even with the regime in terms of Turkey is part of the Astana trio, setting up de-escalation zones. So in narrative, Erdogan is still very fiercely anti-Assad, but in practice, the steps that Turkey took inside Syria strengthened the Assad regime. So it put Turkey in a very awkward position. And I think it in a way weakened its position vis-a-vis the Syrian opposition. So Ankara has been concerned about how the civil war in Syria will end. The fight against ISIS has slowly wound down, and the Assad regime has retaken territory with the help of Russia. So Turkey, in a way, by creating facts on the ground with the Afrin operation, Erdogan carved out influence in Syria. Of course, meanwhile, the US signaled that it may stay in Syria and keep working with the YPG. And of course, that's a nightmare scenario for Turkey that has long wanted to believe that the YPG-US partnership was, as stated by many State Department officials, it was transactional, it was not a long-term partnership. So that announcement coming from Washington that the US might stay longer really raised eyebrows in Turkey. So Turks thought that the Kurds using the U.S. partnership, they would be empowered and they would expand their influence even further. So I believe through the Afrin operation, Turkey wanted to force U.S.'s hand and change its YPG strategy. So that was the plan from the Turkish government's perspective. And I think there are several problems with that plan. Right after the chemical weapons attack by the Assad regime, actually there was a summit between Iran, Turkey, and Russia in Ankara recently. After the summit, the Iranian president reportedly said that they would want Turkey to withdraw from Afrin. And right after that, that weekend, the chemical weapons attack, Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, also said that they would want Turkey to hand over Afrin to the regime forces. So that's a huge problem for Turkey because Turkey depends on Russia. That's how Turkey could be able to launch that Afrin operation with the green light from Russia. So now Turkey is very vulnerable to what Russia and Iran says in terms of Turkey's long-term military presence inside Syria. So Turkey's position in Syria is now very problematic. On the one hand, obviously there are many problems between Turkey and the United States. So in a way, Turkey put all its egg in the Russian basket, working very closely not only in Syria but on energy. As well, Russia is building Turkey's first nuclear power plant. Turkey is planning to buy S-400 from Russia. Turkey is obviously dependent on Russia for its energy needs. So Turkey is in a very vulnerable. So in that relationship, Russia-Turkey relationship, Turkey is the weak partner there. So Turkey welcomed U.S.'s recent decision that President Trump wants to pull out from Syria, but I think that is problematic because that will make Turkey even more vulnerable vis-a-vis Russia's Kurdish policy. So I think he must have foreseen all these, and I think that's the reason why Erdogan called for snap elections. So it was partly, I think, the number one reason was the troubling signs coming from Turkish economy. President Erdogan, since he came to power in 2002, banked on that economic growth. But recently, there's, given the widening current account deficit, inflation, and also the fall in the value of lira against the dollar. So these are all troubling signs for Turkish economy. And I think he wanted to get ahead of the economic troubles by calling for early elections. But I think another reason is also he also wants to capitalize on the nationalist sentiment that peaked after the Afrin operation. So I would like to stop there. I don't know if you want me to cover. I can talk about the snap elections, but I think it's better if we cover that.
You can say a few words about that if you want to.
Well, I think the opposition is now. They're hopeful. Many think that the reason why Erdogan called for early elections is he's very vulnerable. That's a sign of weakness, and that's why they're hopeful. They think that they can capitalize on that, and the referendum that was held, the referendum to switch the presidential system, it was a difficult win for Erdogan. He lost major cities. So the opposition is hoping that this is a great moment for them. They might be right. I think the fact that he called for early elections, I really think that is a sign of weakness. But on the other hand, it shows that he feels vulnerable. But on the other hand, the playing field is not going to be level. The main opposition figures are in jail. Almost 90% of Turkish media is under the control of the Turkish government. And he recently passed legislation that would open the door for fraud. According to a new law that was passed that allows civil servants to monitor polling, for instance. and unstamped votes can be counted. And also the ballot boxes can be moved around. So these all, of course, raise questions about how free and fair these elections will be. So the opposition is now carrying out a shuttle diplomacy. The main opposition party, the CHP, is talking with the Felicity Party and the Good Party. I don't know where they are. I think towards the end, at the end of the week, they will announce their candidates. And there are new hopes that maybe the former president Abdullah Gül might be willing to run, because many think that he might be the only person who can challenge Erdogan. I have my doubts about that. He's been, even when he was in a real position of power, when he was the president, he was unwilling to challenge Erdogan, and he's not a risk taker. So if he decides to run, I think he will have certain conditions. He will want it to be bulletproof. He wants to, in his mind, make sure that he has a real shot at winning elections. And that is only possible if the main opposition parties can unite behind him. And I think that is very difficult. Just this morning, I was reading in the paper that Good Party leader Meral Akşener, he refused to join the opposition. So I think she will be the candidate of her own party. So it's a very divided opposition, and of course that will work in favor of Erdogan. But I think we'll know more towards the end of the week. But no matter what happens, I think even if Abdullah Gül decides to run, I believe that he will, if someone is going to challenge Erdogan, it has to come from the center right. But even if that happens, I'm not very hopeful about the elections. If you ask me a few years ago, I would say that Turkish democracy has never been perfect, but there was one thing that really worked, and that was the elections. And that changed, I think, with the Turkish referendum. So I believe these elections are existential for everyone, for all parties. For the opposition, this is the last exit for Turkish democracy. And for President Erdogan, this means more than his political survival. So I think he'll do everything and anything that he can in his power. So he's, I think, bent on winning by any means. And these recent legislations that passed are not giving me hope. So I think if the Western world wants to help, that's an area where they can actually play an important role, send more monitoring groups to monitor elections. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Much food for thought. We'll go with our next.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Sonam, for the invitation. And thanks, everybody, for coming. If you follow the Washington Institute Twitter feed, you'll know that you're reminded every 15 minutes I'm about to speak. So thanks for your social media team is very active. Yeah, good job. Far more active than the Atlantic Council, so hint to our own team. I'm going to do my best to summarize the positions from within Syria about olive branch, the Turkish incursion into northeastern Syria, and then try and connect that to recent events leading up to the snap elections scheduled for June 24th. And because Gönül and I spoke on a panel together last Friday, she knows that I actually disagree with her, so I'm not broadsiding. But I have a slightly different interpretation of what's driving Turkish decision-making. So I think if you look at Syria, you have two different camps. You have basically, or three different camps. You have the U.S. camp in one side, which I would broadly define as the counter-ISIS coalition, where the U.S., where its primary vehicle on the ground is the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, where the primary component is the YPG, Syrian Kurds for short, which has leadership ties and main buy-in from the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, an insurgent group active in Turkey since 1978, violent since 1984. Then you have a tripartite alliance between the Assad regime, the Russians, and the Iranians on the three side. And then I would throw Turkey in there as an appendage off of that tripartite alliance. Now, they are not an ally of Russia, they are not an ally of Iran, and they are not an ally of the regime, but they are similarly, within this context, not allied with the United States or that second bloc on interests inside of Syria. And so I think if you look at it from an American perspective, which I'll touch on later, is that the interest within Olive Branch and Turkey's cross-borders incursions, Euphrates Shield, and then Olive Branch, is not so much about sort of the tactics or the nuts and bolts of how it took place, but how those operations, independent of the coalition, impacts American goals in Syria, which, as I understand the president, remains narrowly defined around counter-ISIS and then trying to figure out a way to withdraw. And within that first bloc, that tripartite of Syria, Iran, and Russia, their goal is very easy to discern. It's that Assad remains in power and that hostile foreign actors are eventually kicked out of Syria. And their how is very easy. It's overwhelming force and sieges. There's a logic to civil war and violence. The United States doesn't particularly share it, but these three actors do. And they are not incongruent with history. They are more or less continuation of history in terms of how to win, in their context, a counterinsurgency. Whereas if you go to the Turkish interest and the driving factors for Euphrates Shield, but then more to the point on this panel about Olive Branch, I would say it's less domestic politics focused and more security, security, security. So if you are President Erdogan and his top bureaucratic staff and you are looking at developments in Syria and Iraq, and you have a resurgent PKK insurgency in the southeast since July 2015, what are you going to do about it? Especially if you're independent of the United States. You have divergent goals. And if you know anything about how to wage an insurgent, or how to fight a counterinsurgency, one of the things that is you need to deny safe haven to your actor that you're fighting against. And so if you're in Ankara, you look at what was once a little blip in Kandil, extending into southeast Turkey, now spreading across the border into Syria. And from a Turkish perspective, under the guise of fighting Islamic State. Now, this is not to suggest that Turkey has common cause with the Islamic State, but I would say for Turkey, the Islamic State is more or less a police and law enforcement problem, whereas the YPG, PKK is a military problem. Where if you were a Western country in Europe and the United States, you would invert that. PKK, YPG is a police law enforcement problem, and especially if you're a European country, it takes from finite law enforcement resources that you would rather put on ISIS or al-Qaeda. And if you were the United States in particular, and Europe, France probably being the most concrete example, this is a military problem, Islamic State, to deny them safe haven. So that is the basis, in my opinion, of the incongruity of interests. So if you look at Turkish incursions, first you have Euphrates Shield, the little rectangle. It is militarily aimed at Islamic State, but it goes deep enough to prevent the YPG from pushing across to connect with Afrin, which becomes Olive Branch. You push the YPG out of Afrin, and you have Turkish-controlled territory across northern Aleppo. Then if you look across into Iraq, the main crossing point between Syria and Iraq is for the PKK would be Sinjar. What does our President Erdogan say? We're going to move down to Sinjar unless the Iraqi forces get control of their borders. You know, this all makes logical sense to me. Even if I don't particularly agree with how the Turks are carrying it out, it nevertheless has a logic to it that is very easy to follow. But if you plug that back into those blocks, the U.S., the three, the tripartite, and the Turks sort of hanging out in the middle, what you have is a United States that is militantly focused on eradicating ISIS in the final pockets down there by the Euphrates River Valley. And in order to do that, we only have one horse. It's the Syrian Democratic Forces. So how do you get the Syrian Democratic Forces back on side to fight on your side to kill the Islamic State so the president can enact his promise to leave? You have to then manage and this is an uncomfortable thing for U.S. officials to say, but I'll say it because I'm not a U.S. official, 2 different alliance structures. SDF, local partners, we call them a partner, but I think it's deeper than that by this point. And then the Turks and all that means within the context of NATO, broader U.S. foreign policy goals within that. And so you have a Turkey who is measuring its own interests, and I think this is what's driving a lot of their decision-making as it pertains to Russia. You have Turkish need to get acquiescence from the Russians for cross-border military operations for that security card. And I would say the dominant narrative where the Russians have overwhelming leverage over the Turks was accurate probably back in, when was it, June 2015? Was it 2015 or 2016? But less so now. In that the Russians, as they become deeper and deeper involved in this war, I take them at their word that they actually want to solve this thing so long as their central core interests are addressed. And for that, they need somebody to deliver the opposition. And in that sense, that's the role Turkey plays. And so if you're looking at an algebraic equation for the Russians, and you look at Olive Branch, Idlib, where they have this de-escalation agreement with Turkey and the Iranians as part of Astana, is greater than the irritant of Afrin. But I would say for the other 2 members, Syria and the regime, this will be something that will come back in reoccurrence. In that second part of the equation for those 3 actors is you want these foreign forces out of your territory. That's the United States, and I would say that's the Turkish armed forces. And if I know anything about how the Iranians and the Syrian regime try to put pressure on what they would call occupying forces, it's running IED, insurgent network attacks to bloody up and eventually force popular withdrawal, popular upward pressure to force withdrawal. So if you're looking at the immediate success of Olive Branch, it was militarily, tactically successful, much better executed than Euphrates Shield, and I can go into why in the question and answers. But talk to me in a year, and in 2 years, where you still have Turkish forces manning checkpoints in territory where the YPG is still there. You know, they tactically withdrew from a city. They floated away, and you have the other 2, Iran and Syria, perhaps acting in ways that are incongruent with the Russians. And then finally, if you're the United States, I mean, Rich can talk about this. This boils down to Manbij, this little Syrian town that, I mean, honestly, I didn't know what it was in 2014. I couldn't find it on a map. But now it's the centerpiece of the U.S.-Turkish relationship because what it means symbolically over Ankara trying to break that second alliance between the U.S. and the SDF. And honestly, I think Olive Branch and Euphrates Shield has actually been, if you're a Turkish policymaker sitting in Ankara looking at the whipsawing of U.S. policy on this issue, you've been successful. You've managed to push U.S. positions into such discomfort that the U.S. position now is different than the U.S. position before the Trump administration took power. It's been incrementally shifting, even if there is still no agreement on how to solve the Manbij question. So zooming out, I call this state of affairs strategic incoherence, because the United States can't get what it wants without making concessions, and I think that starts with recognizing that the president says the U.S. is going to leave and figuring out how to do that, while securing counter-ISIS gains. And if you're Turkey, you want a united Syria, but Olive Branch and Euphrates Shield are creating rival political structures to that of the central government that I don't know what they're going to do with. And so if you zoom this out to the elections on June 24th, you have 87%, according to the last public opinion poll of Turks who support olive branch. 62 strongly, 15 somewhat. So you have a high percentage of Turks that support it. And if you look internally at Turkish numbers, I mean, I just get an opinion poll. So it's just one opinion poll, and it's every 2 months. So the last numbers I saw were in March. Erdogan looks pretty good. I mean, his numbers are strong. But the trends are negative. And this doesn't come from all the stuff that Gönül talked about with foreign account, with potential economic problems, but how those economic problems are impacting the everyday voter. And so when they're asked what is their top concern, it's economy and terrorism as the top two. But when you say individually, what do you feel most, it's economy. And then individually with terrorism drops down into the single digits, 2 or 2%. This is a personal thing that affects me. So if you have looming economic problems coming, I think that the political calculus is to go fast. So in conclusion, I mean, what I would say is, despite my sort of positive prognostication about Erdogan's political chances, I think it's always useful, particularly in our own experience, for some humility. Because we all would have told you that Hillary Clinton was going to be president back in 2016 because of the Great Blue Firewall and all of these things. So maybe the voter turnout models we're looking at and making assumptions about will be different this time around, but we'll have to wait and see. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Aaron. And Rich, you're next.
Thank you, Sonair, for inviting me to the Washington Institute. It's a place that does such valuable research that I've been a proud student of in various ways and partner with sometimes as well. It's a pleasure to be back. For Gönül and Aaron, thank you for teaching and giving lots for me to chew on as well. I was busy scribbling notes as you both talked and find great and fascinating insights in what you've said. I am the senior military advisor at the Department of State, at least in policy planning and on the Army side. I need to mention right up front that I'm here in my capacity as a personal commentator, and I do not represent the views of the United States government in any of the parts that I work for. So don't hold them responsible. They may hold me responsible. I have been commenting on following Turkish relations with the United States and specifically on Syria for some time. And have generally been uncomfortable with the course of what I think Aaron referred to as strategic incoherence, because I think we've actually been strategically incoherent for some time, and I've been a critic of that. And I think this is such a fascinating time because we've sort of reached, all that incoherence reached a crescendo of sorts in January, and that I think was related, whether it stimulated or sort of was interacting with Turkey's Operation Olive Branch. On Operation Olive Branch, to me it was, I guess a bit of a surprise in terms of the timing of it, but not that it actually took place. I think if you've worked with Turkish military intelligence or political officials in any detail over the previous couple of decades, you realize that there is a strain of geopolitical thinking that is at the heart of how they view the world. And I think looking at the control of territory and how the territory affects access to borders and to resources and influence and how it confers legitimacy in negotiations and things like that. It's not exactly sort of a blood and earth type viewpoint, but it is a very hard-headed approach to the waters and the lands that surround Turkey. So I think this is not just specific to Syria, but also to our interactions over Iraq since 2003. The real complications in our relationship started when we became very active in those near lands and waters around Turkey, and it's of extreme sensitivity in the strategic culture of the Turks. So the idea that there was this growing threat from a group, the YPG, that the Turks see as integrally connected to the PKK, their number one perceived security threat, and that they saw a growing relationship, which I think some signaling from the United States indicated, although we were describing the relationship as temporary and tactical, there were reasons to infer from certain public statements and actions that it was actually morphing into something much more than a temporary and tactical relationship. And to that extent, I agree with the analysis that says, yes, it's about the territory and the geopolitics, but it's also about messaging the United States and about breaking, and I think This is not just for the Turks, it's probably a valid statement for the Russians and for the regime as well. What they saw as an emerging, very dangerous alliance long-term between an empowered YPG that wanted autonomy at least from the central government and had sort of, in their minds, a blank check both in terms of time and resources from the United States government. I don't think that's how the United States government viewed it, but I think that that perception was real. And I think that sort of reached a breaking point, and I think with some statements that I think I actually, in the case of Secretary Tillerson's speech at Hoover in January, I supported very much that statement of a comprehensive approach to the Syrian crisis, one that laid out a willingness on the part of the United States to stay for a while and try to work these out. Unfortunately, that had the effect, I think, in Turkey of stimulating the worst fears, that not only were we going to stay for a while to work things out, but we were not going to transfer or transition the nature of our relationship with the YPG. I can tell you that there was always thinking that we would transition the nature of the relationship with the YPG because it is tactical and temporary. It is bound up with the need to operationally defeat ISIS, which is a threat to Turkey as well as to the United States. And that fundamental proposition that we had to do that together, and that even if our Turkish allies were not happy with the way that we were doing it, that we would get to a post-ISIS period where we could work through that. And that calls for a certain type of very patient diplomacy and working through things in a very incremental, careful manner. And I will say of my former boss, Secretary Tillerson, what an amazing job he did in this regard. His trip to Turkey and his willingness to take, which I had the opportunity to travel with him on, his opportunity to speak to President Erdogan and to speak to our Turkish counterparts at a time of fever pitch of mutual mistrust and the things that were going on in the Turkish media with regards to their perceptions of the U.S. and what they were doing in Syria and the tensions from Olive Branch and how it was being perceived in the United States. And he conveyed a sense that we very much value this relationship, that we understand the historical roots of the alliance, and this one is an alliance, and that despite the ups and the downs in it, that we remain invested in that alliance, and we'll work through the problems. He did a fantastic job of that. Now, did he actually solve any of the specific problems that were on the table in that set of meetings? No, but we had a framework moving forward to talk about it in the manner that allies should. And this was the working groups that grew out of that. So I just want to tip my hat to Secretary Tillerson for having done a remarkable job in what I view as a very difficult diplomatic assignment, which was in that particular trip to restore sort of a floor of trust. Now, with regards to Afrin itself, let me just say this. The geopolitical logic of it makes sense to me. That's why I was not surprised terribly much, as does the sort of broader political logic. But there was real surprise in Washington, I think, when it took place. And the sorts of things that I heard in the circles that I talked to, they started with sort of one of 5 misconceptions. The first misconception, I think, is that the Turks won't do anything about this because they're always saying that things cross a red line, but they haven't actually crossed a red line. So they're sort of like a rubber band that you can stretch and it never snaps. So misconception number 1. Anyone who's studied Turkish history, I think, will come to the conclusion that when the Turks exhaust the other options they believe they have, they will act. They did that in Cyprus. They've done it in northern Iraq on several occasions. I'm not endorsing any specific use of military power. I'm just saying the Turks have demonstrated a willingness to use military power when they think their red lines have been crossed. Second, there was a misconception that the Turks wouldn't be able to pull it off, that the Turkish military had been so decimated by both the divisions within the military that led to the coup attempt of 2016, but also sort of the process that followed that in terms of trying to weed out people whose loyalties to the state were not complete. And so for instance, just looking at the number of F-16 pilots, that they were so short on F-16 pilots that they were not going to be able to generate the air support to make this happen. Well, I think that the Turkish military demonstrated that it had learned some lessons from problems they experienced in Operation Euphrates Shield. And frankly, I think they did better than many Western observers thought they would. A third was the misconception that either the Russians or the regime would turn this off, that they would not allow the Turks to have access to airspace and so forth. That turned out also to be not true, and I suspect that Turkish diplomacy in the weeks leading up to that with the Russians and the regime had something to do with that. And then finally, I'd say the misconception that the Turks would sort of botch this on the execution within Afrin, that if they went to Afrin city, there would be massive civilian casualties and that there would be a huge humanitarian crisis that would prompt an international outcry. I think we don't have perfect evidence of that, but from and I do want to caution that it's extremely important that the Turkish military and government make clear, accommodations for international access, UN and so forth, for humanitarian relief in Afrin. That remains a challenge and a very important task that I would call to mind. But I think it's fair to say at this point that the worst fears of what might happen haven't come to pass in that. So if you look at those views or conceptions about what could have happened, I think we have to judge that the operation did not down-perform to its worst possibilities. Whether it is a long-term political win for Turkey sort of depends on what follows from that. One can sort of foresee a couple of different possible outcomes, including Turkey deciding it's done what it needed to do and gets out. Our experience with that hasn't been solid on the United States side, so I'm not sure that that's the most responsible thing. Finding the best possible package of stabilization, both in terms of military, economic, diplomatic, that's probably the route to go. Turkish forces are still in northern Iraq. They started going into northern Iraq, I want to say in 92 or 93, not too long after the first Gulf War. This shows that our Turkish friends have the appetite for a long stay if they think that they have to protect their equities in a given place. Now, let's see, Israel in its operation in southern Lebanon had a security zone for 18 years. I will be honest, again, personal assessment, I'm thinking that the Turks will have an appetite at least that much if they think that they have not achieved a political solution that meets their minimums. And that, as a friend of Turkey, the United States has to take that into account. I don't think we really want them to stay that long. We would like to see a return to, and harkening back to Secretary Tillerson's articulation of our broader policy for Syria, we want to see the re-extension of sovereign Syrian government control throughout the country after a political transition that is achieved through the Geneva process. Now, probably a lot of you are looking at me thinking, well, Rich, a lot has changed since the Secretary Tillerson made that speech in January. That's true, a lot has changed, and yet that is still our policy. Now, the implications of the President's statement that we want to see a substantial withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria is also part of our policy now, and we're working out in detail what exactly that means, but I don't think it's mutually irreconcilable with the goals that were articulated in the January policy. And at the end of the day, as we all know from studying policy, it is the art of reconciling contradictions. In a democracy, there are always contradictions that are in the policy, so I will assure you that we are working on that. One of the things I like to remind, especially since I'm getting much older now, I remind our audiences, of whom there are many young folks in the audience, is that when it seems that things are at a truly crisis pitch with Turkey, this is about normal. If you go back and look at the history of the relationship, and there's just bear with me for 1 second, from a book written a couple years ago, Alexander Cooley's work, Base Politics, Democratic Change in U.S. Military Overseas. This might sound familiar. A detailed study of social conditions of U.S. troops in Turkey in the 1960s found that U.S. personnel and dependents routinely faced hostile demonstrations, poor community relations, and legal problems. Port calls by the Sixth Fleet became tense and violent affairs in 1968 and 1969, as some U.S. sailors were attacked by groups of radicalized Turkish students while on shore, prompting Turkish right-wing groups to clash with anti-American demonstrators during visits. After the 1975 arms embargo, in a move that would have been unthinkable 15 years earlier, the Turkish government suspended all military activity by the U.S. except for NATO-related Incursion missions. The government declared the 1969 DCA and all other bilateral defense treaties had lost their legal validity, and that all bases in Turkey used by the U.S. would be turned over to full control and supervision by the Turkish armed forces. The action curtailed U.S. military activities throughout the country, and operations remained suspended until the Carter administration negotiated a solution in 1978. In the 1970s, Americans were being killed in Turkey by terrorist groups. In the 1970s, Turks were being killed in America, including Turkish diplomats. I guess I'm just reminding you that this has never been easy, and it actually has been worse. What gets us through at the end of the day is a certain consonance of geopolitical interest, and the fact that we do have a reservoir that's been built up over the Cold War that's not entirely exhausted of mutual goodwill. Now, that said, so our main task from my perspective is sort of limiting damage when we're in one of the downturns. We're in a downturn, it's very clear. There are a number of structural and temporal issues that are making this bad. I want to highlight two, only because I don't want to be accused of ignoring some of the really I don't want to relativize this so much by saying, well, it's always been bad, because the truth is this is a period of some unique danger in the relationship. And I'll mention two factors for that. The first is a very new element, which is the detention of American citizens and of diplomatic staff in Turkey. And I'll mention Pastor Andrew Brunson as one, but he's only one of a growing number, I think over a dozen between our citizens and our diplomats there. We are, at the end of the day, a great power. We are a great friend to Turkey, but we are also a great power. And our citizens should not be detained. And I remember after the Suleimania incident in 2003, when I was in Turkey for that, the visceral reaction that Turks had to the fact of the zip tying and the hooding of Turkish special forces in northern Iraq. I thought that was a big mistake when it was done, because it touched on the Turkish people's pride and sense of personal being vested in those soldiers. And for that reason, I think it was a historic mistake. And I think, unfortunately, what's going on with these detentions is of a similar nature. And I think it would be a mistake for those of us on both sides, both in Turkey and the United States, who are trying so hard to work through these problems through quiet diplomacy, to underestimate the visceral nature of this issue for many in the United States, including in Congress. And we've heard very loud and clear from Congress about how this is viewed. And this may reach a position where those of us working the quiet diplomacy have some of our decision-making authority removed from us, and I'll just leave it at that. And the second thing is about the S-400s. We went through this. I remember Sonair and I worked on a paper together about Chinese air defense systems 4 or 5 years ago, and to me it was never thinkable that the Turks would do that, because there were too many things that would be lost in that process, and we're revisiting that now. The United States offers the best package of high technology, high quality defense articles to our allies. It's very important that some of the technologies are so sensitive. And I'll just say that having an S-400, not so much the missile, but the radar in Ankara, when we have some of our very high technology assets in the same area, is of great concern. And the idea that we're going to jeopardize the special nature of technological cooperation, for instance, in the Joint Strike Fighter and some of these other projects, is very, very concerning. Part of the alignment deal between allies also affects defense acquisition, and I think that this is also an issue that is really on our radar as one of the things that might undercut our ability to work through the rest of these issues. I remain upbeat, but that's only because I'm thinking in terms of decades. I'm not going to go out in terms of June 24th and what's to hold in the election, but I will tell you this: there are people on both sides, the Turkish government and the United States government, who fully understand, appreciate, and value this relationship, and will continue to try to work through these issues. And I think every little bit that the policy community, and especially senior national leaders, can do to help us keep the healthy ground for that, then the quicker we'll be able to get out of this relative downturn that we're in. And with that, my remarks.
Thanks so much, Rich. 3 excellent presentations, much food for thought. Thanks, Aaron. A lot to discuss. There was quite a bit of disagreement, which is good for debate, quite a bit of agreement, which is also good. I think what I heard was this sense that broader consensus emerging that regardless of what drove Turkey's Afrin operation was a success, and I agree with that. In fact, take it to the next level. I would say it was a master stroke for a number of reasons. First, because Ankara successfully forced the U.S. to make a decision on this incongruous relationship that the U.S. has with the YPG and with Turkey simultaneously. And, of course, not unsurprisingly, Washington picked Turkey. And I think that was a decision the YPG did not anticipate would come forth so briskly. One of the reasons why YPG collapsed and pulled out of Afrin. But a master stroke also because I think Turkey successfully forced Russia to show Turkey some love and not the YPG and the PKK. And I think that was probably even more unexpected from the YPG's perspective. They thought that the Russians would ultimately not deliver them to Ankara. That happened. Probably another reason why they were withdrew from Afrin in such a haste. And last but not least, of course, I think it's a master stroke from Erdogan's perspective because it did undermine YPG by targeting the only YPG in Syria that doesn't fall under SDF. So had he targeted YPG in the rest of Syria, he would be targeting a U.S. Tactical ally. The YPG in Afrin had never fallen under SDF and therefore had no relationship whatsoever to the broader SDF network. And I think that was a very precision-driven but also a tactically smart move on behalf of Ankara. So all of these really, I think, were strategic drivers of a success, as well as the fact that, of course, the operation, I think, has helped President Erdogan's chances of winning elections. which was one of the reasons why, together with many other analysts, I was predicting back in February, March that Turkey would have snap elections, so that was not a surprise. I really do want to go into the snap election. So what I thought I would do is, before I open the floor, pose a question to each of my co-panelists here. And for Gönül, it is going to be on the election. So I agree with you. I think it's going to be hard, Gönül, that opposition may not be it's hard for the opposition to come up with a united candidate. It already looks like they're divided. But one of the interesting drivers of this new election season is that it's what I call the law of unintended consequences. So this new legislation which allows parties to have electoral blocks, which is unique in Turkey. Parties have ran on joint lists before in the 1990s, but that's an exception. The norm in Turkey is that parties run on their own, even when their platforms are very similar. I think it has a lot to do with the nature of Turkish politics, driven by leaders who are very charismatic, dominant, and feared. In some cases, this meant that parties that had exactly identical platforms ran on different lists. That was basically the story of Turkish politics in the 1990s, when True Path Party, DYP, of Çiller, and Motherland Party of Yilmaz ran on complete different lists. They were basically identical, and that actually ended up with them decimating each other and Turkey's traditionally dominant center-right pillar, which allowed Erdogan's AKP to rise from the margins of Turkish politics and capture the center when the DYP and Motherland Party decimated each other because they could not run in a coalition, although they had exactly identical platforms, except for the fact that they had leaders who hated each other. So taking it one step further, post first round of June 24th, assuming that no candidate gets 50% majority, would this force, because of the fact that the election will also encourage pacts between parties, many of which will enter pacts, even though they don't like each other, because there's a pretty high 10% electoral threshold. It's the only way these minor parties, many of which are under 10%, will get into the parliament. They will have to form coalitions holding their noses. So if that happens, you have tactical coalitions to cross the 10% threshold. Could this encourage some crossing across the aisle between candidates, bridging Turkey's traditional left-right, secular, religious, Turkish nationalist, Kurdish nationalist divisions for the first time? And could this therefore usher in, after the first round, a joint candidate for the opposition, as unlikely as this seems now? So where do you expect candidates to cross those fault lines, the aisle, I guess? That's another question. Aaron, I think I'm going to ask you about Syria. Again, great conversation. Your point about Syria's actors and how Iran, Russia, Assad regime is one of the key actors and Turkey is an appendage. And I think towards the end you nuanced that and you suggested that Turkey's dealings with Russia are often opposed to by the Iranians. So taking it a step further, do you see any more daylight in terms of Turkey policy between Iran and Russia that could result in Russia being the fireman and Iran being the arsonist, whether it's in Afrin or the next deal, let's say in Idlib, whatever that deal is? I get the sense that Turkey deals with Russia on an ad hoc basis. It deconflicts and deals with Putin, so it makes temporary deals. It happened in Jarablus versus East Aleppo. Something similar happened in Afrin. And when that happens, what is the potential of the Iranians to be the arsonist and to undermine, and that daylight between the two of them getting wider? And of course, I think for Rich, I guess the question would be again on Syria, the issue of something we haven't looked at, Idlib. You know, you mentioned a near permanent or short to long midterm Turkish presence in Jarablus and in Afrin. Do you see anything of that sort of developing also in Idlib area, given what Turkish priorities and the other groups in the region are? So I'll start with Gönül and go through the floor, and then please feel free to weigh into each other's questions. Should be a three-way conversation, sir.
Yeah, first, before answering your question, I want to go back to Aaron, and he already knows what I'm going to say, but the rest of you don't. So I think, again, I want to challenge this notion that Afrin operation had nothing to do with domestic politics. Every step that Erdogan takes in foreign policy is about domestic politics, because foreign policy remains the only realm where his posture, his narrative resonates beyond his constituency. And that is very important. So he has nothing left. When he came to power in 2002, he had a very positive agenda. He promised democratic consolidation. He promised economic prosperity. And to his narrower constituency, he used this narrative of victimhood, that resonated very well within this constituency that felt like they had been marginalized under the secular Kemalist elite. And right now, having been in power for 15 years, he cannot really use that victimhood narrative. He managed to change the dynamics and managed to create a large middle class. And also he cannot credibly promise democratic reforms or economic prosperity. So I think that's why an aggressive foreign policy posture is about the only thing that remains for him. And he'll do everything. So that really resonates, again, well beyond his traditional constituency. And that's why Afrin operation has the backing of 80% of Turkish population. So add the anti-Americanism and the anti-Kurdish sentiment in the country at the moment. So I think that's why whatever he does in terms of foreign policy, it's about domestic politics. And also to reach if I understood you correctly, you said that Russians gave a green light, and thanks to Turkish diplomacy. I think it had nothing to do with Turkish diplomacy. Turkey had been threatening a military incursion into Afrin for over a year, and I believe the only reason why the Russians decided to give a green light was due to American announcement that they were going to establish a 30,000 strong border force. The Russians, Iranians, and the regime, they were all nervous about a potential long-term U.S. military presence. So it was Russia's way off. So by allowing the Turks attack Afrin, Russia first wanted to weaken the YPG, and thus, through weakening the YPG, curb U.S. influence in Syria, and also wanted to force the YPG's hand, and push them to give concessions to the regime. So I think that was mostly about the American narrative and actions. And also, in terms of Turkish military presence, I think it will not depend on Turkey's own decision whether Turkey stays in Syria or not. Erdogan would certainly like to stay in Syria. Turkish forces are building post offices in the regions that are captured by Turkey and Turkey-backed forces. Children there, Syrian children, are learning Turkish. Turkish forces are training police force there. So he certainly, he wants to stay there, but it's not up to him. I think at the end of the day, the Russians, Iranians, and the regime will call the shots. And also that brings me back to what Soner said, that he said that Afrin operation was a success. I agree with that, but it was a success because Erdogan managed to score points at home, not because Erdogan, yes, he made himself a player in Syria. But again, it's too early to call it a success because we still don't know what the Russians have in mind. We have an idea. Lavrov made it clear recently, Iranians too, and the regime was never very happy about Turkish military incursion and the long-term Turkish military presence. So it's a bit too early. Wait till the Russians force Turks to withdraw. So Turkey can always, for a face-saving way, they can say we've completed our mission and we're withdrawing. But I don't think that's what Erdogan wants. And your question whether the opposition can get together and whether this could be, well, it could, but I think the candidate against Erdogan in the second round has to be someone who is acceptable to ultra Turkish nationalists and Kurdish nationalists. And it's not easy, and that's why, and I'm only saying that because I've heard pro-Kurdish party representatives say that this morning Abdullah Gül could be a candidate because I think they would be, if let's say Meral Akşener, the candidate of Good Party, I don't think the Kurds will be willing to vote for her. But Abdullah Gül is a figure who is who can draw votes away from the AKP, and that is very critical. And I think the CHP can I've been seeing that there are many people within the CHP who are saying that I will never vote for Abdullah Gül. He didn't lift a finger when he was the president. But I think I think there is still enough pragmatic people within the CHP who can vote for him just to challenge Erdogan. And the Kurds, I think Kurds will be much more willing to vote for him than Meral Akşener. So again, I think it all depends on who the candidate is.
You seem potentially as someone who could bridge the Turkish Kurdish nationalist, left-right, secular conservative divides. But in your view, Abdullah Gül?
Abdullah Gül could certainly do that. I mean, if within all the options available that's been debated, I think Abdullah Gül could be a credible challenger.
All right, thank you, Gönül. Ern, you're next.
Rich.
Rich, okay, all right.
Mine will be shorter, I think.
Okay.
Just on the issue of diplomacy, I take your point, Gönül. Of course, history is littered with opportunities for potential cooperation that don't get actualized. So the fact that the Russians wanted to do some of the same things that the Turks did is important, but it's a precursor. The actual decision, that's how diplomacy happens. So if you look at the series of conversations and travel from Turkish general staff as well as from senior Turkish leadership with the Russians in the months of January and December, it's pretty clear that they were talking about this. And again, even just looking at the U.S.-Turkey relationship, so many things that we could have done together we didn't do together because we weren't able to actually have the right conversation. So I take your point. It's not a miracle that was worked by Turkish diplomacy, but turning the potential into an actual cooperation is something that I respect as a diplomatic feat. So that's what I meant about Turkish diplomacy.
I'm going to take the elections because it's much more fun for me than Syria. But I'm going to do both. I'll be very quick on the elections. And I think this is ultimately where the Turkish political parties will end up, is that rather than agree on a joint candidate in the first step of a two-party runoff, is that it'd be more advantageous for them to each field their own candidates. So you're shaking your head, but we can to drive turnout, and then in that second round, try and come around a consensus candidate who could be acceptable across those sort of wide chasms in the Turkish polity to be the anti-Erdogan vote. This all assumes Erdogan doesn't get 50% in the first round. So I'll leave that there. But in terms about this, as I call it, the tripartite and the Turkish appendage, it's because I call Turkey the appendage because I adopted U.S. language where we call the YPG a partner, and so Turkey's like the partner, but it's not an ally. Where do we see? So where I think we see daylight is within this diplomatic back and forth between the Russians and the Turks. You have obvious Iranian regime frictions, and I'll point to three different incidents that I look at retrospectively as examples of this. One is that a Turkish drone killed Turkish soldiers in Euphrates Shield. That seems like a relative, when they got a little too far afield in what I would assume is the broad parameters of where the Turks couldn't go. That's one. Two is within these de-escalation points in Idlib, you've had the regime shell Turkish positions and kill a civilian personnel, a civilian attached to the Turkish armed forces. That's two. And then three, with an olive branch, you had the introduction of local militias to try and stop the Turks as it became clear that the YPG defenses were bending. Where I think it's important for U.S. policy is that it shows the chasms between the YPG and the Russians. In that I think before Olive Branch started, the Russians were having simultaneous diplomatic talks between the Turks and the YPG and the Americans. And that the Russian terms to stop Olive Branch were in excess of what the YPG was willing to accept. And so if you want to project forward into a peace process type atmosphere through Geneva, those chasms between YPG acceptance for future governance arrangements and the Russian position are wide open, even when you have a Turkish anvil bearing down on the YPG itself. And I think that will have, and then within that, you have those Syrian regime and Iranian tensions with the Turks that I fully expect them to try and get more aggressive with as this turns into years, not months, in terms of Turkish presence in the region. And so reason why I call it strategic incoherence is because every actor that I see involved in the Syrian civil conflict says a lot of things, but literally when you line them up in terms of ways, ends, and means, can you achieve what you say? Can Turkey put the central government back together in Syria while it appropriates territory, building post offices, imposing all these things? Probably not. Can the Russians get all these three sides on the same thing? I don't think so. Can the Americans use this piece of territory as leverage to force a political capitulation that Russia and Iran will accept? I don't think so. So what does this actually mean? And that's why I call it strategic incoherence.
Can I ask just one question? Why do you think it's advantageous for all, is it better for all opposition parties to have their own candidate in the first round? That's too risky for me. I mean,
because I've heard because I think in the first round you want to get voter turnout as high as possible, and that if you have CHP stay home or vote for spoiled ballots, or EE vote for Akşener as a write-in, or HDP vote for Demirtas as a write-in, you'll have a whole lot of spoiled ballots. And the AKP-MHP alliance, you may have some MHP slough off and vote Bahçeli or some who knows. But the AKP will be in lockstep. And so if you have spoiled ballots in the way Turkey counts votes, I would want all my parties to turn out and vote for the candidate that they want if your goal is to beat him. But, you know, as I said, maybe my voter turnout assumptions are wrong in the initial presentations. So we'll see.
well, I think the turnout is going to be high. Again, this is an existential, that's how it's viewed in the country. So the turnout is not a problem, but the main risk, if each opposition party has their own candidate, that's very risky because they have to beat him in the first round. And if the opposition is that divided, I don't see how it's going to be very difficult for the opposition.
On Idlib, to answer your question, Soner, Idlib's a little different from northern Aleppo, either on the Afrin side or on the Euphrates Shield Zone side, in that the nature of the terrain is different, the demography is different, the nature of the threat from the regime is different. And I continue to think that Idlib is an area where there's potential for cooperation between the CT alliance, the Defeat ISIS alliance, and Turkey in this regard. And by that I mean there is a strong residual presence of al-Qaeda-linked terrorists that are in Idlib. That's Nusra and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is, I think, the latest iteration of it. They are fighting against this Jabhat Tahrir al-Sham, which is less ideologically extreme. It's not quite, the fighting is continuing. It's not quite clear what Turkey's role is in this. This is part of the area that Turkey has kind of walled off as a de-escalation zone. If in fact Turkey has a hand in helping to do the sort of slicing down of the most radical elements of the HTS and sort of trying to encourage or incentivize moderation on the part of the JTS in a way that leads to the sort of resumption of services and maybe post offices and things like that, they can actually create some stability in that area. I don't think that's their primary focus right now, but I would think that that would not be a negative outcome in terms of our interest in Syria. I don't know that their interest, because there is no proximate threat of YPG or other PKK-linked groups in Idlib per se. It's a very small presence there compared to what's in Afrin, which is predominantly Kurdish. Without that proximate threat, I would guess they won't have as much of a desire to stay for the longer term. But I think the medium term matters here as well. And if they can get the stabilization piece right and kill off, maybe even with our support, if it turns out that way, some of these most extreme interests, extreme elements, the al-Qaeda-linked elements, that would be win-win.
So in other words, Idlib would be a more soft area of Turkish presence, not necessarily as hard as it's in Afrin and
Makes sense to me.
Yeah. I'm going to open the floor to questions now, but before that, I'm really tempted. I'm not supposed to do it as a moderator. I just wanted to bring Gönül's and Aaron's comments together. I think what is really fascinating is it's the first time Turkey is going to have an election where two ballots are going to be cast at the same time. Earlier it would be presidential, parliamentary, local, separate polls, one vote every time. This time it's two polls. So the question is how do these ballots interact? You know, when you go to the polls, if you're voting for one candidate on the presidential, and if you're voting for another party in the parliament, will you split your vote? Turks have never done this, or will you combine your vote? And what could be interesting is to see, I think the next 2 months until 24th of June is probably going to be one of the most dramatic periods of Turkish political history. It's whether all these talks about electoral pacts between parties will also force candidates to unite or endorse each other. That has also never happened. And when that happens, of course, that could create a sea swell in the first round or in the second round. So that'd be all interesting to watch, especially as the concept of vote splitting or combining your votes in the ballot has never existed in Turkey, and people are going to be asked to do that for the first time. So floor is now open to questions. I'm hoping that you'll ask questions and not comments. Be very brief and wait for the mic to come to you, and please identify yourselves. There's a mic going around the room. Yes, Larry?
Yeah, Larry Mandel, retired from the State Department, spent a couple of years in Turkey from 14 to 16. I have a two-part question, I think, for each of the panelists. And the first part is, we talk about Afrin as if it's over. Erdogan has talked about continuing his eastward momentum if he needs to go up to the Iraqi border. Rich, you talked about that a little bit, but could you all expand on whether you think that that's going to happen, or at what point would it happen if it was to happen at all? Then the second part is, traditionally Russia and Turkey have their own antipathy and need to continue to balance out that relationship. Turkey has always been reluctant to get too close to Russia for historical reasons. So assuming that that continues to play out, how does Erdogan rebalance his relations with Russia and his relations with the United States to come to a better sense of equilibrium at some point?
Who wants to go?
I can take a little bit about the expanding operation piece. And Larry, thanks for the question. That's actually two really good questions. But with regards to Afrin, and then, of course, thinking about places that have been talked about further to the east, both Manbij and east of the Euphrates, it is a very, very different proposition due primarily to the presence of U.S. forces in that area. So we sort of consider that entire area from Manbij into Raqqa and down to Deir ez-Zor and further still very much a live theater in terms of defeating and preventing the return of ISIS to those areas. And frankly, they're in this gray zone in terms of governance, where the regime obviously is not in a position to provide services to those people and has its own legitimacy problems. And we understand the salience of the issue for Turkey. Manbij has this special role for the Turks because of the nature of conversations at the time that it was taken from ISIS between senior national leaders on both sides. And there was the idea in Turkey that this was sort of an understanding that they would go back across the river. That has calcified on both sides as a conversation of the deaf, in essence. Part of these working groups that Secretary Tillerson put into place was to address that issue, because at the end of the day, I think the U.S. doesn't have an interest in seeing a particular form of governance imposed on that area. I think we agree with Turkey that Manbij ought to be run by the Manbijis. And how that happens, though, has to happen and occur in a way that is both based on this delicate conversation, because we are talking to two different sides in this conversation, an ally and a local partner. And I think in their more pragmatic moments, our Turkish interlocutors understand that's not something that you just cut. That's not something that you just throw into the bus and say, turn around and leave, or we're going to, that's not how that works. There has to be a very gradual transition process and some mutual trust building. So how that happens over the coming months is going to be a real challenge for diplomacy, but I think we can absolutely identify a status and a future for Manbij which results in minimums being met for everybody. Which is, at least from my perspective, not the regime being back in there and not ISIS being back in there, and Manbij essentially running the place. Now, a lot of that needs the space and the time for this patient diplomacy that we talked about, and I'm not going to guarantee that that happens, because events can get ahead of us. The Russians certainly, and the Iranians, I think, have an interest in disrupting that. If they can get and turn those areas into a battlefield before we have the chance to sort of deconflict between ourselves and the Turkish supported forces, then this all goes sideways in a hurry. So that's why there is some urgency to the nature of those conversations between the two sides. If I were a betting man, I'd say I don't think that operation is going to expand. I think from the American perspective, we have to assume that the Turks are serious when they talk about that, but I think the Turkish side also has to know that that is the least effective, least optimal way to resolve the set of issues that we have about Turkish security on the border. So rebuilding trust that the Turks understand. We really want them to be secure on their border. We really want local rule, not by an ideological group of any stripe, but by local people in Manbij and elsewhere. I think that kind of trust can be built incrementally, and I believe in the end that's how we're going to solve the problem.
Right. Anybody wants to go for a Russia question? Gönül?
I agree with Rich. I mean, I think the U.S. and I guess multinational presence, I should say now, in Manbij is a deterrent, and I would say that expands across the border. And I would, again, just to keep up with the events of the panel, slightly disagree in how Sonar framed it earlier. Is that I think Olive Branch forced a decision on the U.S. side, and that decision actually has been to double down again on the counter-ISIS fight. And in order to get the SDF back involved in that final pocket is to, this quiet diplomacy Rich is talking about, is to put it on hold because of the transition between Tillerson and Pompeo on one hand, but also the necessity of realigning interests between the U.S. and the SDF around this counter-ISIS goal has been to push back compromises with Turkey on Manbij so that the SDF will go finish the job. And so I would say if you're looking at that as a 6 to 1 year timeline, 6 months, excuse me, timeline, and then stabilization will have to take place, you can have money being appropriated, you know, for train and equip funding for SDF, I would say probably out till 2020, which will exacerbate those tensions. In my office, I keep a picture of the USS Missouri sitting anchored off of in the Bosphorus, going back to how the U.S. and the Turks became allies and the Russia threat. I also worry that bureaucracies involved in sort of tactical diplomacy ultimately becomes calcified and hardened, and that the iterative relationship between the Russians and the Turks over this has gotten to a point where if Ankara is serious about consummating this S-400 arrangement, it will force not just congressional action, but actions in State Department, in DOD, and at Commerce. And then Brunson on top of that. And so you have a trend line and trajectory for things that are sort of not really related to the bilateral relationship. Like CATSA was because Congress was worried that Trump would trade back things to Russia and not punish them for electoral interference. It wasn't about Turkey, but Turkey will ultimately become the test case into how this will be executed because of a decision made about S-400 before CATSA was before CATSA came into play. Same with the nuclear deal. I mean, the nuclear deal is all about financing, you know, but that was in 2010. That was 8 years ago. But these are things that will crystallize and percolate within the interagency on both sides, and you come out the other end and you sort of ask yourself, now what? And that's where I worry about is the pathway is just getting narrower and narrower and narrower.
Well, rebalancing its relations with Russia and the US, it's always been very difficult for Turkey. It was difficult in 2008 during the Georgia war. It was difficult just recently when the US responded to chemical weapons attack, when the Turkish president said we support the attack, but Incirlik Air Base was not used in the attack. So it's always been a balancing act, but it's becoming even more difficult because Turkey is deepening its ties on energy, on trade, and in Syria. Turkey has to work with Russia, so no one can ask Turkey to pick a side. It's not possible. And it's not rational either. What is rational for Turkey is to keep a balance. But right now, what the Turkish government is doing is, again, putting all its eggs in the Russian basket. And until now, it was easy because the Russians were, again, the anti-American sentiment is strong, and the Russians are giving Turkey what Americans did not in Syria. So it was easy. But wait till Russia tests that. And it did it before. In 2008, for instance, when Turkey was, again, trying to strike a balance, Russia, if you remember, when the U.S. sent the ships to the Black Sea, Russia used trade against Turkey, as a weapon against Turkey. And I think that was a reminder to the Turks that they really cannot cross the line with Russians. So it's a very difficult act, and I think the U.S. will, of course, it all depends on the level of tension between the U.S. and Russia too. But I think the U.S. has to admit that Turks, they have to work with Russia. But what is unacceptable is, Aaron said to Americans, is the fact that a NATO country is buying S-400. So I agree with the statement that it will be a test case. But other than that, deepening ties in Syria, especially if Americans are really considering pulling out of Syria, a close Turkey-Russia partnership in Syria is not a problem. And also in the region in general, Russia is trying to expand its influence in the region. So these two countries, they have to work, they have to cooperate. But when it comes to a matter of NATO, I think that is a huge problem. So it's important to watch what happens on the S-400 front.
Aaron, since you mentioned that you have a picture of Missouri, I have a picture of the mosque on Mass Avenue, which is not only Washington's only mosque, but it was also built beginning of Cold War. At the time, the Turkish ambassador in town had passed away in part to serve as for his funeral. So definitely a very interesting sign of U.S.-Turkish relationship building. Carol, you're next. Wait for the mic, please.
Carol Migdalovitz, previously of Congressional Research Service. I'm just curious what there is in the history of the Erdogan-Gül relationship that leads anyone to conclude that Gül would be willing to take on Erdogan in the presidential election.
I think that's to you, Gönül. And
No, just yeah, you want me to answer?
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Just a couple tweets that you sent out recently. Well, we know that there's been tension, but it was never became public until recently. But there was always disagreements and tension. But I think I agree with you. There are not enough signs. We can agree that there's tension and disagreement, but I still I don't understand, especially looking at the history of Gül's presidency and his personality. I don't understand how people are so hopeful about him running against Erdogan in the upcoming elections. I mean, it could only, again, there's one condition: if the opposition decides to unite. If the CHP, Felicity Party, Good Party all come together and say that you're our candidate, I think he might be willing to run. But other than that, he won't take the risk.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, one final. Yep. Oh, I see two questions, so we'll do both. Question here in the middle, and then question on the right. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Melik. I'm with the American Turkish Council. My question is for Colonel, but feel free to jump in. Colonel, you mentioned two things which actually creates a kind of opposition view at the Congress against Turkey. What should we expect from the Hill and from the State Department against those actions? And how would that affect the S-400 deal? How would that affect to Turkey's cooperation in the Joint Strike Forces? And my second question is that today is the French President Emmanuel Macron is over here meeting with the President Trump, and how would that boost up with the U.S.-France relations, affect the cooperation between Turkey and U.S. in the Middle East? Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Melly. Great questions. So the U.S. Congress plays a very interesting role in the composition of our foreign policy, sometimes to the chagrin of the executive branch, but I think ultimately to the benefit of the democratic function of our governance. Congress typically does not run day-to-day decision-making on foreign policy decisions. But because of their role in providing the budgets and approving the funding for what we do, and also because of their ability to sort of take the pulse of the American people, because they are in contact and most answerable directly to the American people, they can sort of round out what it is, the sense of the nation, the sense of where we're heading on things. Their ability to hold hearings and to confirm nominees for positions also gives them an integral role. So it's easy to overlook the role of Congress, I guess is my point. I think with regards to your question about when Congress has come to a conclusion that something is not headed right in our foreign policy, What does the State Department do about it? Well, in the first case, we normally try to stay very tightly linked up with with Congress. We have an Office of Congressional Liaison. We do briefings on the Hill on a regular basis where people, usually a little bit higher than my level, will go over and talk to staffers and talk to members. Normally, we try to make the case for the relationships, the bilateral relations we have, whether it's about defense industrial cooperation, whether it's about visits by seniors, whether it's about a project that is important to particular congressmen. Those conversations go on all the time. Sometimes we're convincing and sometimes we're receiving and being convinced. And I will tell you, just having watched the kind of the arc of this particular set of conversations on the things that I mentioned, which is the detention of Americans, and on the S-400, we have more or less made the case. And what has changed is not the case we're making, but the tone of the nation and of Congress on these issues. And I think it's fair to say that patience is running out. And this is not because we don't value Turkey's opinions on these things. Turkey has, through its interlocutors, expressed certain views on their judicial process and on their defense industrial purchases and why they think they're doing what they're doing. But I will just tell you, at this point, probably Congress is not in a mood to be convinced by what we're doing in the State Department on these two issues. So the conversations continue, and I think the best thing we can do as friends at Turkey at this point is to convey just how serious an issue this particular set of issues, these two issues are, just how serious those have become for Congress. And I will tell you, I've been watching this relationship since 1990, both in uniform and as an academic. This is serious in terms of the mood of Congress on this, and I can conveying that to our Turkish friends is the best that we can do on those two. With regard to your second issue, there's a lot of things that can happen in terms of if there's a security consideration within Joint Strike Fighter or any defense industrial program. I think one of the things that could happen would be, and with S-400, sorry, it's not so much about the missile, but the radar. Just think about this. You're going to have a big Russian-made radar with lots of Russian-made computers and sensors tied into it, essentially able to access and watch and measure everything that some of our most advanced technologies do. That will be a significant change to the conditions under which that program is being developed right now, and I think there's something called a work-share review that would be the first step in that. But let's just say it becomes very complicated. It's a very big change in the set of assumptions that were made when we all embarked on that program. So that's why I think that's such a serious issue as well.
As a think tanker, I'm supposed to say that the U.S. government is awful at everything and that they listen to me, everything would be better. But on this issue, particularly from the executive, they've been very crystal clear with the Turks about the consequences of S-400. It's absolutely about the radar, and it's Russian technicians will have to service this thing. And two, I mean, it's sort of analogous, but like the U.S. Army had to stop using DJI Phantoms because it shared data with the central DJI company, and then the key leaked, and so you could access it. So if you flew DJI Phantoms in a U.S. base, you could, in theory, access the video from a central server in China. You don't want that. This obviously is much bigger because Turkey will fly F-35. And so the advanced frontline strike fighter of the entire NATO alliance will be flying in and out of a Russian radar that collects. It's not passive, and it stores in its library what the airplane looks like. And so if they have access to that, which they will, they'll be able to refine how they can shoot that thing down. And I think it is absolutely a must that this thing gets stopped, because it's often said that there's the sanctions, but then within F-35, Turkey's a Tier 3 partner, so they will at least get 2 aircrafts, and it's legally unclear if they will be able to get the 98 that would come after that. But within that, because it's a co-production arrangement, Turkish firms have competed and won contracts to do servicing of F-35, to create components for F-35, and they have a second supply line run out of Ankara. Those are subject, within the intergovernmental agreement, to a number of restrictions on data security. Now, if you plug that into the Turkish Air Force network, and then you plug in your F-35 diagnostic into the Turkish Air Force network, that will not meet data security. And it's less so on denial of exports rather than on denial of licenses for all of these things. And I will tell you that you will have other defense things that will come into play, like a Sikorsky helicopter deal, something along those lines. This has all been transmitted to the Turks in multiple fashions at the highest levels, at the working levels. So the U.S. government is doing its part. The question is, why isn't the Turkish government listening? That is the question I cannot answer, because it would seem that this would be a consequence, not an outcome, but a consequence of the going back to the initial question, of the Russian-Turkish cooperation in Syria, that there are political strings attached, and that those political strings are driving decision-making in Ankara, unintended outcomes of unrelated things, and perhaps the senior leadership in Turkey, because it's all been jumbled with how SSM makes procurement decisions with the transition to the presidency. Maybe the message isn't getting through. You know, you have to assume that at the top levels, you have President Trump, President Erdogan speaking through an interpreter. By nature, President Trump is not an expert on ITAR. Nobody is, except for a very small cadre. Those talking points are simplified, to use the correct term from the New Yorker. And then they're sent through a translator. And then that simplified comes out on Erdogan's side. Does he really understand what's going on here? And is that message being transferred up in the bureaucracy? Those are the questions I want answered, but I have no idea.
All right. Well, I'm sorry, we're out of time, and if I haven't been able to get to your question, I apologize, but the panelists will be here, so please feel free to come up and chat with them. I thought this was a great conversation of quite a bit of agreement, quite a bit of disagreement. That was the idea, but also very sobering. The better reason to gather this panel again very soon. So please join me in giving my co-panelists a round of applause and thanking them. Thank you.